Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So this morning I am so excited and very pleased to be joining you. Got a little bit of an echo here.
That's just the
Okay.
speaker system. So.
And I have two things I want to talk with you about. One is that World War I memorial that sits at 287 in Arapahoe, and how that came to be, how they came to be there, and what's the issue with them now. That led me to do a lot of research on who those memorials are really dedicated to, who they represent. And I want to share some of that with you as well. So I'm old school enough that I'll probably just hit enter here. So, the pillars today, and we talk about them as the pillars of at 9 Mile Corner. They are at the intersection of 287 and Arapahoe. They sit in multiple jurisdictions. So everything on the east side of 287 is now the town of Erie. The northwest corner is in unincorporated Boulder County. The southwest corner used to be in the city of Lafayette, is now in the city of Erie, and Erie says is going to go back to Lafayette. And we know how well governments work with each other, so there are a bunch of issues that came from that. They also sit in the middle of Colorado Department of Transportation, CDOT's right-of-way. And that is a significant problem for us. In case you hadn't noticed, there's been a lot of development in East Boulder County. Erie has sort of exploded in population. Lafayette, Louisville have grown as well, and that's had an impact on the towers. The thing that's really triggered the need to do something is when you look at the transportation planning that CDOT has done. Arapahoe Road is going to become a major east-west multimodal transportation link. What does that mean? Well, it used to be 2 lanes. Used to be 2 lanes in each direction. Now it is a strange and bizarre combination of 5 lanes on one side, 3 on the other, and people have no idea where they're going. What's going to happen, and the question is it in 2025 to 2030 time period, or 2030 to 35, and that depends on CDOT funding, is they are going to add at least 1 more regular traffic lane. They are going to add a designated bus lane, maybe 2, depending on whether or not they decide they're just going to reverse the direction of that lane based on time of day. And separated from the roadway, there is going to be a designated pedestrian and bike path. So what is now sort of this is going to become that. And that's really triggered the need to look at these. The other thing I'd like to tell you before I get too far is I'm absolutely fine with you guys asking a question when it occurs to you. If you are absolutely fine, excuse me, with me saying, hold that thought, I'm going to come to it, or let me answer that at the end. So if you have a question, let me know. So this is what they look like today. The infamous, let's see if we can actually make this work. Nope, we don't. So the infamous pork chop island. Not particularly a good solution for that. What did these look like in the past? Some of these I see that you have. The one in the center comes from when these were dedicated in 1928. And based on the newspaper articles that I see from that time, this was kind of a big deal. We had a number of people who came from out of state to see this. On the left side of your screen, you see the park that was created. That included a World War I, at least one World War I artillery piece, which unfortunately, as the local fire chief has told me in the past, was hit many times by drivers who could not figure out how to turn and just ran into it.
Oh, God.
And that's still a problem today. On the right-hand side of your screen, those are victory bonds, yes.
You know where the piece is today?
I know where it isn't. So they were moved to Legion Park on top of the mesa at about 65th Street. And as far as I know, it has disappeared from there. And I really don't know if it's around anymore, to be perfectly honest. So this is World War II era. So you see the VE bonds, and you get a good idea of what this looked like about almost 20 years on from the time that they were built. To understand why they got developed, you have to look a little bit at what was going on in Colorado before World War I. So a couple of things are pretty significant. None of us here, I think, are old enough to remember the idea of the Lincoln Highway. But the plan was, in 1913, we're going to create a single paved road that goes from New York to San Francisco. And it was supposed to go straight from Omaha to Cheyenne. So how do you think that sat with Colorado legislators? Not so hot. So you see there's a little kind of a triangle there. That was called the Colorado Loop, and there was a lot of lobbying to make that happen. It takes off from western Nebraska. I've gone back and forth about where it actually left that highway, to Denver, and then straight north to Cheyenne. So can anybody think of some complications that might have occurred with that?
Mountains.
Oh yeah, well, we had a great attraction that we wanted to bring people to, Rocky Mountain National Park, 1915. The big complication was that we really didn't have a north-south highway to get to Cheyenne easily. So a lot of scrambling, and what gets created is a Lincoln Highway that goes straight from Denver up Public Road in Lafayette, so that's the main drag, takes a little jog over by the cemetery, up North 111th Street, and you see these little guys? Winds its way around a couple of reservoirs that are there, takes a jog over at Isabel Road, takes another jog over at Jasper Road, and heads straight north to Longmont. Not paved, but it worked. It was straight. Predictable problem. The biggest municipality in Boulder County is the city of Boulder. And this didn't take people to Boulder. And Arapahoe, which was at best in places a farm road, it was dirt, not paved, was called the Valley Road. You know, it didn't draw people to Boulder. In fact, when they measured, about 75% of drivers went north to Longmont and not to Boulder. So what's predictable? Boulder's going to be ticked off about this. So what do? Many short-term efforts to get people to come to Boulder. We had a series of billboards. We had folks who handed out flyers saying, come to Boulder, great places, best access to the glaciers, all of that, and a lot of political maneuvering. And this went on basically until we hit U.S. entry into the war. And there are three things that we really need to pay attention to here at this time. The war itself had a very significant impact on Colorado. That was from April of 17 to November of 18. We also coincided with the pandemic from January, February 1918 through April of 1920. And I'm going to come back and talk about that more significantly because as all of us who've lived through COVID, that had a pretty profound impact on the people who lived here. The other thing I didn't know was Colorado was ahead of the curve when it came to prohibition. Colorado became a dry state in 1916. Nationally, it was 1920. Do you think people were still wanting to get that nice cold beer or a little bit of whiskey? So we have a pretty major bootlegging operation between Colorado and Wyoming, because Wyoming was not dry. And one of the men I found in my little research effort was the son and the grandson of a bootlegger. And I would be willing to bet that he might have driven a car once or twice up to Wyoming. And I could take you to the house on Public Road in Lafayette that was their soda shop. Yes. Okay. So we get through the war years, and we have a lot of, I would say, tension at both the national level and the state level. I was talking with someone a little bit earlier about how our memory and our recollection of World War I has sort of slipped, and how we've failed to do a good job of telling its history. So there are a couple of national trends that we saw. One is there was a lot of disagreement about how to ratify the treaty and the impact that President Wilson's stroke had on that effort. Everything that I can read about that time period really says that Wilson was fixated on the League of Nations and that he was not going to be supportive of things of treaties that did not include that. He also had a stroke, and under normal circumstances today, we would make the assumption that the vice president would be acting. That did not happen in this case. All of the information suggests that Wilson's second wife and one of his staffers were essentially running the country at that time. So there's a lot of push-pull about this. The second thing that was a broader issue was the issue of repatriation versus sacred ground. Should we bring the bodies of the fallen back to this country and bury them with their families, or should they be interred where they died in sacred ground? The proponent of sacred ground was Teddy Roosevelt, and Teddy Roosevelt had a lot of power at this time. Teddy had a son, Quentin, who was an aviator, who was lost in the war, and he very strongly came out on that. So there was a negotiated settlement, which resulted in American cemeteries in Europe, mothers' pilgrimages there in 29 and 30, and the option of bringing bodies back. So that tension played out nationally and here. There were some areas of agreement. This is where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier comes from. This is where Armistice Day comes from. And this is where the Gold Star Families program comes from. So we saw this play out at the national level. In Boulder, however, we are back to exactly what we were dealing with before the war, which was Boulder is not happy about how this Lincoln Highway is going to take people north. So the first thing that happens is that Boulder Rotary creates a Good Roads Committee who says these dirt roads are very, very dangerous. They're dangerous to vehicles, and so therefore we should pave them. We should pave Arapahoe Road and get that done so it's safer for people. Second thing that happens is nationally there's a program called the Road of Remembrance, and that was led in Boulder by the Lions Club. It coincides with the time when we began to think about planting trees and Arbor Day. And so the theory was, all along Arapahoe Road, which we have just paved, we're going to plant trees. And we're going to create a magnificent, welcoming gateway for our returning soldiers coming back to Boulder. Boulder County Commissioners came out and said, we can solve that terrible dirt problem where people have to jiggy-jog around the reservoirs. We're going to build a 6-mile north-south highway, current Highway 287, and predictably, there's nothing there. There are farms there. So the land deals and negotiations begin. Longmont does not like this approach at all. And so now we get into some very interesting things that they did. I've brought for you a couple of handouts and a reference list of where you can find some of this stuff online. Because what we ultimately end up doing is we buy the Wise family farm, which is where Erie's Historical Museum now sits, to let this happen. And in the meantime, Boulder is still busily handing out pamphlets saying, come to Boulder. First firebombing of the 1920s is mysteriously some evening, the nice little welcome station that Boulder built gets firebombed and is destroyed at 10 Mile Corner in Lafayette. So political infighting ensues. Finally, in 1926, the state and the feds say, we have the money to build that north-south highway. You guys figure out how to do this deal and get it done, and we're going to fund the highway. Boulder Lions built the pillars. I was mentioning to someone, I know the granddaughter of the stonemason, 100-year farm here in Boulder County. The American Legion in Boulder added the German artillery pieces in 1928, and that's the plaque that's on the north pillar. So, Gateway to the Road of Remembrance. We never did get the trees all built. I think they figured out that it's hard to grow trees here in Colorado. There are some of them, however. There is a road to remembrance that was constructed that's in Mississippi. There's one in Arkansas. So there are vestiges of this elsewhere, but not in Boulder. So what goes on after that? Well, from 1930 to today, I would say that what might have been disinterest after these pillars were built turns to neglect. And in fairness, I have to say, we had a depression, we had World War II, we had Korea, we had pieces of Vietnam, and we had an unbelievable amount of development in East Boulder County. So CDOT decides they've got to widen the road. 2 lanes is not going to cut it, and there is this bad Y intersection where the guy keeps running into the artillery piece. So CDOT, God bless them, in and of themselves said, we're going to move this pillar. They did not bother to do a number of things that they should have done, namely figure out what's a good way structurally to move this. So they jack it up, they put it on a cart, which promptly gets stuck in the mud, and the tower collapses. They did rebuild it. They set it about 18 inches from private property on the north side, which creates another series of problems. And probably the most significant piece is they're legally mandated to do a historical assessment of things that are in their right-of-way in their path, and they failed to do that. That comes back to haunt them. So my DAR chapter, one of our things is historic preservation. And so in 2015, we began to try and raise the issue about, hey, we need to preserve these pillars. They're a memorial. And I would tell you, this was a project that was kind of like swimming in peanut butter. You could get one set of people that needed to be involved in the process to the table, and the other would take a stage left. And you get somebody else. And bottom line is, we were totally unsuccessful at getting anyone to pay attention. But the one thing that we did that really was helpful is we created a pretty large digital footprint about this issue. So 6 years pass, and we have a developer who is going to develop 9 Mile Corner. You know, we really need another Lowe's and a strip mall and all of those things. But that's the plan. And CDOT told the developer, hey, you're going to have to redesign this intersection because it's not, you know, we're going to have a lot more traffic. They didn't tell the developer that they needed to do an assessment either, which also creates a little issue for them. So, you know, I have to say that we got really, really lucky. One day, a retired attorney whose name is Bill Meyer drove through the intersection and said, and I'm going to probably paraphrase, "What the heck?" Looked at this sort of pork chop island and said, "Oh no, this can't be." Gets involved and has the skills to unravel the ownership of the towers, the jurisdiction that they're in, the fact that these are documented as eligible to be placed on the historic register. They're listed on the World War I Commission's historical spots, or I guess spots is an okay word, in Colorado, and that CDOT and their developer had totally failed to do this. The good piece is that when I say this guy, Bill Meyer, is a good attorney, I mean this. He is good at holding people accountable, but he is equally good at not pissing them off. And so he managed to get CDOT's attention and get their commitment to do something about this, to resolve these issues. Out of that came the mitigation working group, and that's how Bill Meyer found us. It now includes State Historic Preservation Officer, Lafayette, Erie, Historical Societies and Commission, the American Legion, the VFW post in Lafayette, Historic Boulder. So it's a coalition of people who are interested in history. And the first thing that he thought we really needed to do was build some support. And so that's how I came to be involved in this other project about identifying who and what the pillars represent. So as we went out to do some of these community meetings to say, we need your support for this project, my job was really to begin to talk about them. So what Bill typically brought to the table was what I shared with you. What was the motivation of the movers and the shakers who were in this mix? My job was to say, what does that mean for the rest of us who aren't county commissioners? What does it mean for us as the man in the street? And so my focus really has been that these are a memorial. They are not just a pile of rocks that sits at the intersection. They represent people who sacrificed for this country and a number who did not come back from this war. So that's where I'm going next. And in order to do that, I have to backtrack a little bit. Because this was what we needed to tell people so that they understood. For the first few years of the war, the U.S. took a position of neutrality. And that was clearly Wilson's, his philosophy and his upbringing. We saw some red flags when the Lusitania was sank. We saw an even more interesting one in 1917 when Germany moved to authorize unrestricted submarine warfare. And the issue for the U.S. was this, that although we were not involved in the war in terms of men, we were very much involved in the war in terms of materials. So we were supplying England, for example. And although England adopted a policy of escorting convoys of ships, the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare jeopardized not only lives, but some of the economic interests that were at play in the war. I think the final straw was the Zimmerman telegram. How many of you have heard of that? So, an intercepted telegram, and one wonders how it got intercepted. Is Germany talking to Mexico saying, hey, guys, if we win, you get Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and part of Southern California. This did not play well. And that may have been one of the triggers that brought us into World War I. Unfortunately, we were not really prepared. In 1917, we had a standing army of 127,500 officers and enlisted men. We had some individual state militias and state guards. In terms of an organized supporting force, we were missing pieces of that. The other thing that really became obvious is that we did not have much in the way of naval resources, certainly not the kinds of vessels that Germany had been building. You know, if you think about the ancestors of battleships and cruisers, we were still back in the 1890s, 1880s in terms of what our Navy was, and it takes a long time to build boats. So that was an issue for us. And although people enlisted after war was declared, enlistments were not going to be enough to meet the need. And so we get the Selective Service Act. 3 drafts. The first in May of 1917 took men from 21 to 31. The one the following year catches men who turned 21 after the May 17 date, and the last was men from 18 to 41. A couple of things were different about this draft. No substitutes. So I have a patriot in the American Revolutionary War who was a substitute for the rich guy that married his sister. No substitutes this time. That also means we're going to get a very different mix of people, and that had implications for us. To make it a little more real for Boulder, here's a couple of things to know. In 1910, the population of Boulder County, all of it, was 30,000 people. Lafayette's bigger than that today. Of the group who were eligible to serve, and there were about 6,800. So think about what proportion of the population is eligible. About 1,500 did serve, and of that population, 50 did not come back from the war. The odds, I think, are really, really good that you would know someone who served, and you might very well know someone who did not survive the war. Where were they from? Half of them from Boulder. Not surprisingly, Longmont, Louisville, and Lafayette make up another good chunk, but we have a number who are from places like Altona, Gold Hill, Sunset, places that are now ghost towns. We had a lot of folks who were not particularly affluent. 85% of them were natural born, which tells you the other 15% are immigrants. Of the group who were discharged, and that's 5% of the 1,500, of the group who were discharged because of illness, injury, or death, half of the group died. So, a lot. We also better talk right now about the Spanish flu, and that is a gigantic misnomer because it didn't start in Spain, although the King of Spain did get it. So what epidemiologists say is that in January of 1918, a doctor in Haskell County, Kansas, and that's way southeastern Kansas, talks about finding a particularly virulent kind of flu. In March 4th of 1918, Camp Geary, which is now Fort Riley, a cook named Albert Gitchell became ill. 3 days later, more than 550 men there were also ill. By March 11th, they had already found this same disease appearing in other military camps as far as Queens, New York. Of that flu, and there are waves in these things, far and away, September to October of 1918 was the most lethal, and it spread by how we moved men and materials. So it had a profound impact on folks who served. Oh, come on, no, I want you to be smaller. When I started talking with people about this kind of stuff, this is what people started to relate to. And it's what made me say, well, maybe I should try and do a little more here. And out of that came the idea of a soldier's story. So one thing DAR is pretty darn good at is genealogy. And so we did a lot of genealogical research. I'm curious, and so I want to see what is in all these old newspapers, what I can find in historical research to build this story. And I'll tell you, there's a piece of this that's very much the mindset that an investigator has to use when they look at these pieces of data and say, how do I relate them to each other? What caused this? So I have a list of resources, and it'll give you the names of the primary sources that we used. They're decent. One right after the war, one done in the 40s by the Office of the Adjutant General. They're really, really good in terms of Army and Marines, and obviously the Navy was not talking to them at that point because there are no Navy references in those documents. What we knew when we started was we knew a person's name, we knew their rank, and sometimes their specific assignment, what branch they were with, and what their post office was. Something else that DAR is pretty good at is we're kind of into wandering through cemeteries and transcribing headstones. And so we had Louisville, Lafayette, Superior, and Erie, and they have, Louisville has a World War I memorial. So we were able to pick up a lot of information that way. So I worked with my volunteer genealogist to connect these names to family, so I could know who their parents were and who sometimes their grandparents were. Once I had that, then it was on a roll to see what else I could find. So I'd like to introduce you to some of Boulder's boys. And I use that terminology because that's the way they were referred to in the newspapers. The way we talked about this war in the newspapers of the time is we talked about it as the Great War. So I'm using that terminology. So if you look at this picture here, what do you see that might tell you something about him?
He was an officer.
Wings.
Officer.
Buckley.
His name is John Buckley, and he's the young man for whom Buckley Field, Buckley Air Force Base, Buckley Spaceport, whatever it is. It's named for him. He died as a result of a mid-air collision. He was I would say, certainly officer candidate material. Couldn't prove exactly what he started as, but I do know how he ended. So here are some things about them in general. Their average age when they died was between 20 and 37. So if you think back about the ages, we definitely had some enlisted folks, and we had some very young folks. 40% of them were born right here in Colorado. So I've heard from a number of you that you're 5-generation families. These guys would be too. 25% of them born in Boulder County. But again, we have a pretty significant group of immigrants. I had expected actually more Italian immigrants based on Louisville and the mining history, but we had folks from Denmark and Sweden and Russia and Poland, and I'm going to tell you the story about one of those guys. Thing that blew me away is 30% of them were descended from a Revolutionary War patriot that I could prove. And 2 of them were Mayflower descendants, which tells you when you look at the lineage of these men, there's a history of service. Some of them, every single war that this country has been involved in, someone in this person's line served in. 15% of them were married, and I know of 2 known children. I so badly wanted to find a descendant, and I did not do that. I did find descendants of a brother, and they still live in Boulder and gave me some of the pictures that I've got here. Lived on Mapleton Hill, and I have a picture of this guy driving his horse and buggy in front of the house. Of the 2 known children, one died as an infant in Wyoming during the pandemic. One was the child of a doctor who died when she was probably 6 months old. I think based on the speed with which her mother remarried and what I could see of the census and court records, that child never knew that her natural father was not the man who raised her. So, good to find related folks. Half of them enlisted, which obviously says the other half were drafted. And here's what sort of struck me. Almost 70% of them died of influenza. And I will tell you, most of them in that September and October 1918 period. There were some other causes of death, meningitis, tuberculosis, peritonitis, but far and away, the flu killed more of this population than enemy fire did. 45% of them died in France, but more than 20% did not get out of the country. They died in the training camps. About 60% are buried here in Boulder County. And one of the things I'm working on with several of the other DAR chapters is trying to do a joint memorial service for these men, since I know where they are buried. 20% are buried in a military cemetery, 1 of them at Arlington, and 9 of them at various American cemeteries in France. I also like to kind of look at it a different way. This is a cross-section of Boulder. On the one hand, there were people who were affluent. John Buckley grew up in Longmont in a house with servants. It is very clear that that was an affluent family. They are educated. I have a number and a couple that I'll talk with you about who were either students at CU, one who was a practicing physician, another who was a practicing attorney, So, an educated population. Obviously, they spoke English. And a number of these were eager to serve. These are people who had this service to country, I think, instilled in them as children. And in many cases, it's by a grandparent who served in the Civil War. On the other hand, I have folks who were born in tents in the mining camps up in the mountains. So we have rich and poor folks. I have two men who I know could not read and write because they signed their draft card with an X. I know a number of these men did not speak English. And think about this. I've drafted this guy. The language he speaks is Italian. So how am I going to command this guy and communicate with him? And I have at least one man in this group who I think died because he could not explain to people what was wrong with him. He died of a ruptured appendix. And I have a number of folks who were not quite so willing to serve. And you can begin to pick some of that out. But what you're looking at are some of the pictures of these young men that I found. And I think the fascinating piece, in a lot of cases, is seeing who they looked like, who they were. And in some cases, I have their letters. I have their things that they wrote to family. So take two, it's a cross-section of the world. First guy, and I have 5 of these I'd like to tell you about. The first is a fellow named Meles Robert Jane. So Meles is how the Swiss say miles. And his grandfather, who is also pretty famous, was called Miles. And so to keep him straight, this is Robert. So Robert was born in Boulder. He attended CU at least 2 years. He enlisted in the Marine Corps. His parents were early Boulder settlers. His mother was born in 1858 in what is now Marshall. So these are families who have been here a while. I would say that this is a troubled family. And I say that by sort of looking at, after the war, what happened to the rest of them? Where's mom? Where's dad? Where are siblings? So mom is off in California and says that she's a widow. And I'm sure that it's his mother. Dad is happily living in Denver. So there's no way she's a widow. And there's a lot of speculation in reading between the lines that there was something going on in this family that was difficult. Because who Robert seems to gravitate to is his paternal grandfather, who was a Colorado Civil War vet, who was very active in Boulder politics, ran for sheriff, he was mayor of Ward, had a lot of irons in the fire, a lot of businesses, ran the Ward stage line. And what he did with all that money was he bought land. And you know, some people just get awful darn lucky. Because you know there's an oil field that went up through Boulder County? Guess who bought land smack dab in the middle of it? Grandpa. Then we have the other side of the family that came for the gold rush. And there's some very, very interesting stuff that I found about these guys. So Grandpa buys a store in Niwot, and the very next day, the safe is burglarized and he's out of the money. So he buys another business, and suddenly the building burns down. And today, I would be saying, this is insurance fraud for sure. I think there may have been something else involved, because the last newspaper article I find on him is that he has packed everything he owns and his family into a car and gone to Wyoming. And where he goes in Wyoming is not a very populated place. So did he have a run-in with someone? You know, I'd say, if I were back in New York State or New Jersey, I'd say, oh, you got crossways with the mob. But I don't know. But for sure, who Robert believed in and followed was his paternal grandparent. So what can I tell you about his service? He's with the 75th Company, 6th Marines. He was at the Battle of Soissons from July 18th to 22nd, and there's some debate about just how long that ranged. He was involved in the Saint-Mihiel, I think that's how you say it, offensive. He won the Silver Star when he was 19 years old, and he was killed in action on September 15th, 1918. I can show you a picture of the tunnel where he was killed. His body was repatriated, and he's buried in Green Mountain Cemetery with his paternal grandparents. He's the youngest that we lost. I also want to tell you about a guy named Edwin Van Meter Evans. This is another family that's pretty affluent. He's the 9th child and the 6th son, born in Taylor County, Iowa. He and his family show up here. He's in CU. I have his yearbook. He was in Honor Society. He was a 3-letter athlete. The quote in the yearbook says, "More stolen bases than any other person in history." Obviously, patriotic, Student Officer Corps. Had previously served with the Colorado Guard in the Pancho Villa campaign. So this is 1916 when Pancho Villa came into southern New Mexico, raided a town, and we decided to chase him. What Colorado Guard did was basically guard duty along the border. He's the son of a Civil War veteran, and this is one of those families that I can say, every war we've been in, someone served. So what can I tell you about Edwin? He was with the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Expeditionary Division. So think John Pershing. That's his first command. A lot of tension about how many men Pershing needed from Americas under his immediate command before he'd relieve the Allies or consider sending troops to the Allies. That would be a good one to do a little bit of research on. There were a lot of issues around that. Edwin was involved in battles on the Soissons front, the Marne salient, and he died on the 29th of July, 1918, along with more than 7,000 men from the 1st Division. He is buried at the Aisne-Marne American Cemetery in Picardy, so Rose of Picardy. This is the place that he's buried. Why did I mention him? He received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions that he took in Soissons. And I look at this and I say, this was not a stolen base that you were able to run so fast that you could outrun a machine gun. But the highest ranking, the highest award in this group of men. This is a guy, Lester Everett Ramsey, who was not listed in any of the resources that I had. So this is about randomness. So I was looking for somebody else. And in the middle there, you see Boulder boy found dead near Camp Mills. And so I decided I'd look and I'd say, who the heck is Lester Everett Ramsey? And what does he have to do with Boulder? Because he's born in West Virginia and he has all of his family going back generations in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Why is he here? In 1900, he and his parents are living in Pennsylvania. So why does he come to Boulder in 1901? Well, I'm going to give you the litany of losses and disasters that Lester Everett Ramsey experienced. And this is him. So his mother, Lillian, dies in 1902 of tuberculosis. That explains why they're in Boulder. Cure for TB, fresh mountain air. We have the Boulder Sanitarium, Mount Sanitas, all of that. I can assure you his mother was not there, but she did die of TB. So Lester at this point is probably 2, 3 maybe, and he has an older sister. So what does Dad do? He very quickly remarries. How are you going to take care of these toddlers? His stepmother has twins, and they were either stillborn or died quickly after birth in 1904. His older sister, Margaret, at the age of 7, dies in 1905. So Colorado had quite a lot of labor unrest from right after 1900 through the 1920s. I mean, we all know about Ludlow, and we know about Serene, and we know about the pitched gun battle between the Hecla mine and the Vulcan mine. And incidentally, Hecla is where Balfour sits in Lafayette, and Vulcan is about roughly where the traffic light is on 42. So big switchman's strike in 1907. So who remembers the old depot in Boulder? Does anybody remember the old stone depot? Used to sit at 29th Street. They moved it again. It's farther east. Well, in 1907, it sat on Water Street, closer to the mountains, 8th and Water. And one of the switchmen decided, I'm going to set fire to the boxcars that are at the depot. Tactical error, the one he picked was loaded with dynamite. Some of the people in Boulder thought that Halley's Comet had come back and struck Boulder. 3 people killed, obviously the guy with the match. but Lester's family lived less than a block from this, and so both Lester and his stepmother were injured. They all survive, only to have his stepmother die in in November of that year. Not of injuries, but disease. Hard to say what. So we now have Lester as a toddler with his father. They are on the dole. And I can find the records of when they were given coal and food. Last record is January of 1910, the 7th, and his father dies on January 11th, 1910. So count the losses. Fortunately, his grandma is still here. And he lives with her for 3 years. And if we had all the time in the world, I would tell you about his grandma's household because it's a stitch. But she dies in 1913. So I would put him in the 12 to 13-year-old age group. And I would say, if my last name started with Ramsey, I would really think twice about living in Boulder County based on Lester and at least one other Ramsey we can probably think of. He goes to live with his last living relative, his mother's grandfather, back in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, which is why I didn't find him in the Boulder records. But he dies in 1916. leaving Lester with a step-grandma as the last person in the world who I think knows him. When I looked at his grandfather's death certificate, one of the contributing factors was listed as melancholia. So think depression. And there's a number of things that make me think that might have been genetic. So Lester had experience as a driver. He drove for a sweet shop in McKeesport. I thought, God, great way to meet girls, Lester. But he was of an age that he would have needed to enlist. And he had a skill. He could drive. And so he was assigned to Camp Mills as a driver. And if you think about that, if it hadn't been for the pandemic, that would have really been a rather safe place to be at this time. Here's what happened. The last known facts I can find about Lester, and I really do mean last known facts. He leaves on a 12-hour pass on the 9th of June, and he disappears from military records. So Camp Mills did a really good job at preserving the day reports. So I could see who was assigned as working, who was not there, who was sick, and he's gone. I find in the paper on July 11th, a badly decomposed body was found at the end of a streetcar line in McKeesport with a gunshot to the right temple. So you think, was this suicide? There were a couple of things that were maybe a little questionable. In his pocket, he had 2 passes. His own, and one that belonged to a man named Jerry Bundy, and it was for a longer time period. So how did Lester end up with Jerry's pass? And why can't I find Jerry either in the military records? So you have to ask yourself, well, if he's right-handed, for sure it's probably self-inflicted. That's what the sheriff there thought. Could it have been an accident? Could it have been homicide? We don't know. Where did he get the gun? Because it's a new gun, and it's not a military sidearm. So where did that come from? Was he AWOL? Well, if his pass said he should be back on June 10th, and he doesn't get found until July 11th, I would say, yeah, he would have been AWOL. But I can't find any record of that either. So, is he one of the folks for whom all the records burned? Possible. We lost a lot of military records in the 1960s in a warehouse fire. Were they hidden? I mean, we have a lot of baggage around mental health issues and suicide. And the fact that I can't find either of these guys makes me a little suspicious. Don't know the answers here, but it certainly made me think that regardless of what happened, this is a young man who needs to be honored for at least what he tried to do and not forgotten. I also want you to meet a guy named Harry Weissman. This is Harry from his high school yearbook. He looks a little old for high school, and he is definitely an interesting character. He was born in September of 1892 in Russian Poland. So Eastern Poland, it's been Russia, it's been Poland, Lithuania's wanted a piece of it. He is one of 6 siblings who emigrate in a chain. So oldest comes first, then the next, then the next, then the next. So they emigrate over time. This was not a good time to be Jewish in Eastern Europe. Even worse if you happen to be in Russia. Harry ends up in the United States in 1912. Quickly gets his U.S. education, graduates from Granite High School, so think Metro St. Louis. He had family there. He had family in Denver and family in Wisconsin. In 1917, he's a med student, a second-year med student in Boulder. So this is a bright guy. So when he registers first in Illinois. When he moves to go to school, he notifies the draft board. When he returns to Illinois for summer vacation, he notifies the draft board. And talk about luck of the draw. Drafted with the last call from Granite City. Okay. So he's a med student. He's attached to the 151st Infantry Sanitary Detachment. Think about that as the group who might run the trains that went from camp to camp, who provided some basic medical supplies, who dealt with camp sanitation. And of all places, he gets sent to Camp Shelby in Mississippi, where somebody learns that Harry speaks English, Russian, Polish, German, Yiddish, and Lithuanian, and just happens to need an interpreter. So this is one of the ones that I looked at and said, huh? What? So in 1918, in October, he is on his way to northern Russia through Quebec. And I'm thinking, what? We sent troops to northern Russia? Yes, we did, and Siberia. So the interesting thing about that piece, I ended up calling the World War I Museum and said, I've seen something in the paper that I've never heard about before. Before I put this in a book, I want to talk to somebody to make sure that I'm not crazy or that the guy who wrote this wasn't fabricating something. And they say, oh no, we sent about 7,800 men to northern Russia, allegedly to rescue 40,000 Finnish troops who were trapped. So I'm looking at 40,000 Finnish troops. We're sending 7,000. Boy, I hope they got a lot of guns, because that doesn't compute to me. And then I started talking with the volunteer about the other stuff that was going on in Russia at that time. So we were mightily concerned about the Bolshevik Revolution, and our position was, if we already have a fair amount of conflict in the US around the rise of socialism and how it tied to labor movements here, we wanted to be in a position to do something. And both places were around doing that.
Do you know what he died of?
Yes, I do. He died of influenza. So another one of these. And I have his last letter home. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read you a part of it, because it tells you a whole lot. He's writing to his brother Jerome. Received Sam's letter yesterday morning. I'm very glad you received the picture and think well of it. I look unusually skinny in the picture, don't you think? I saw Sam Fisher and brother last night, and I shall see him again tonight. He was mad because I did not phone him as soon as I got here. He didn't recognize me, but I did him. He promised me a good time tonight, probably the last night. I shall go to New York because we are going over, likely through Canada. I guess we're going to England. Then he says, please, dear brother, do not worry about me, even if the worst should happen. Fate will direct my actions to a better and happier future. And possible the experience and view of life I have obtained while in the Army will change my future and make me realize all the good things of life as they should be. I'll do my share and pay the German military system to what they have done to poor, helpless Russia. Please do not worry, since I do not worry. And if there is anything to be done to keep me in good humor, I shall certainly do it. You know, Jerome, I have played in some luck in my life, and this is another test. Goodbye, Harry. So, being able to read some of those words tells you a bit about what this man was like and what he might have become. Last guy I want to tell you about is a fellow named Joe Fattar. He's buried in the Lafayette Cemetery, and I've walked past his grave a number of times. It's a little white military headstone. So, Joe was born in Louisville, so he's an American citizen. I mightily wish that the 1890 census hadn't burned, but it did too. So I'm trying to use other resources to say, who's your family, Joe? And I'll tell you, this is the man I know the least about. There is a Joe and a Louis Fattar listed as coal miners in Louisville in 1896. Who's his father? You know, a lot of us would jump to the assumption that this is Joe Sr. and Joe Jr. That didn't always happen in naming traditions. A lot of times we named first son for a brother, first son for a mother's father, so there's a bunch of that going on. The bad news for Joe is that his mother dies in about 1896, and he's sent back to Europe. So what happens? In 1906, at the age of 16, he comes back from a place called Romano, Italy. So it really wasn't Italy at the time. So northeastern Italy, the Alto Adige, borders Austria, and it was the Tyrol. And over time, this land has moved from one country to the next. Sweetening the pot to make this Italian in 1918 at the settlement of the war, Austria had to cede that. So he comes back. I can find him working as a miner in Wyoming until about 1910, when he comes back to Lafayette. And he's staying with some family that he knows, cannot figure out how or if they're related, but does stuff to become part of the community. Joins the Odd Fellows, is out in social events, and you can find that in the, the little 2-second things in the newspaper about what's going on locally. He gets drafted, and he is assigned to the medical depot in Camp Geary as an ambulance driver in September of 1918. That was not a great time, given the flu pandemic, to be an ambulance driver. And 39 days later, he dies of influenza. So we're in the middle of this pandemic. He is buried in the Lafayette Cemetery in the family plot of the Spruce family, whose son Clyde died basically 4 days earlier. No inside ceremony, graveside only. And as far as I can tell, there are no other Fattars buried in Boulder County. In fact, I can't find them. And I will tell you that when it really came down to it, Joe and men like him are the reason that I put this book together. I would be willing to bet you that if you hadn't looked at this book or been the one veteran who in the early 2000s consistently put something on this young man's grave, I'd be willing to bet you that no one knows where this boy is buried. And so I thought, if I can say this man's name and keep him alive. The saying is that we die 3 times. We die when the breath or the spirit leaves our body. We die when we're interred in the earth. And we die the last time someone speaks our name. And so I want us to say the name of this young man and those who are like them, so that we have a way of remembering. One of the things this made me believe really even stronger was that we need to make history relatable to people who aren't trying to get a PhD in history. And we need to do that by telling stories. This lets us see ourselves in the experience of other people. And if you go back to days before we had much in the way of writing, the way we taught people our history, our values, our traditions, is by telling them stories. And so that's my goal in all of this. So I've done a lot of talking. I'd like to ask you what questions or comments you've got.
Where are the pillars being moved to, and why was that location selected?
Okay, so we looked at more than 15 locations. And the top two, well, there were three that emerged as real winners. One was essentially, don't move them at all, make the road be relocated. And as much as I might like to think that would be an option, I live in the real world, and it's real clear to me that they are going to need to be moved. We looked at moving them to Legion Park. And there are two main issues with that. Legion Park is already on the Register of Historical Places. All the stonework was done during the WPA, and it was done by a rather famous landscape architect. So the logical place for us to try and put it, which would have been up at the top, was not going to be an option. Second reason is that the American Legion has a limited lease to that park, and that's going to expire by I think it's 2027, I think. It's certainly gone by 2030. And Boulder County Parks and Open Space, who has that, is adamantly opposed to moving anything there. So we started looking at that and saying, are we willing to try and go around them and go to the commissioners directly? And the consensus of this working group was that that was probably going to be an exercise in futility. And that the second feeling was that these should be kept close to where they were built, that we should not be moving them. One of the places they looked at was putting them on the overlook on Highway 36 before it comes down into Boulder. And the historical folks in this group said, not a good option. We also wanted some place that we could make accessible to people. And so the site that the mitigation working group has proposed, and in theory CDOT has accepted, is a 0.6 acre orphaned lot on the northwest corner of Highway 287 and Arapahoe. So essentially, we're moving them a little farther north. The owner of that lot can't develop it, and so it is effectively a worthless lot to him. However, since smart attorney Bill Meyer set up a 5013C that could be donated to the project. And so we are awaiting formal confirmation from CDOT that they are in agreement with that. They have said that in person and said that in email. And we're also waiting for a letter from the State Historic Preservation Officer that they support that. We anticipate we will have that. So that's the current plan about what happens. And I will tell you, we looked at every other space we could consider.
How are we going to make it accessible? I mean, that's my concern
How-
about the current location that's inaccessible.
Actually, it is very accessible if
I've
you...
never seen a car there. in
No,
30
no,
years.
you won't see a car in this lot. But immediately to the north of it, there is a church, and there is an access road that takes you into Stonehenge, into that division. There is a place to park, and if you are creative in terms of making a sidewalk that goes south from that church parking area, you are on the lot that we're talking about.
Well, that would be great.
So what we're talking about also is creating something of a park there. Who our partner is going to be and what its focus will be, not decided. One of the things we talked about is if you think about plants that were in vogue during World War I, if you think about things like peonies and bleeding heart, there's a group in Denver that's done that kind of a remembrance garden. We have other folks who are interested in pollinators. So I don't care who we find as a partner, but I'm definitely saying we need a park and we need the ability to do a bit of education about this. So think about being able to bring a group of 5th grade school kids who are studying American history and saying, here's a piece that's right here that you can touch.
Are there any other questions? Gail will stay for a little bit, correct?
I will.
But we're running a little bit late. So if you have any further questions, you can come up and ask Gail. I'd like to thank Gail for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.